is a difficult time for us, and it's also unprecedented. And both citizens as well as the governors are trying to figure out this morning what the president's authority is. My understanding is that he would have to invoke an 1800s law in order to do that. But it's quite incredible that we're looking at whether the president can have the military come out against citizens today as
Yes,
we're dealing with the protests and the pandemic.
so true. And I understand there's only ever been one time where that has happened in 1957, and that was really at the instigation of governors. So this is, as you rightly pointed out, unprecedented times.
Indeed, yes.
Let's talk about voting today. How appropriate does your organisation believe it is that several state primaries are actually going to be held?
Well, a lot of the states that are voting today had actually canceled earlier primary elections in response to the pandemic and moved the voting to today. And most states are going to be voting by mail, but there does need to be some in-person options for voters who didn't get their ballots. So unfortunately, while it's not the best environment to be voting, there's having to balance between having voters participate in elections and be responsive to the moment as well.
Well, the District of Columbia is where you are, is one of those that will need to vote today. And DC has been one of those hotspots, I guess, of protesters around the country. What effect might the nationwide protests have on people thinking about getting out and voting if they didn't get a postal vote?
Yes, and it is complicated by the fact that because DC is a hotspot, as you said, there's a curfew in place, and the curfew begins at 7 p.m. this evening, but voting ends at 8 p.m. And so now we're trying to get some clarification from authorities about voters who may need to vote at the end of the day and be out past curfew. And that can indeed have a potential chilling effect on voters. The voting centers are not near where the protests are happening, so we are also trying to encourage people who need to go out and vote. But there is that lack of clarity about what the impact the curfew is likely to have on those who may have to go out later to vote this evening.
Well, what would you think would be the best way of handling those places that have decided to go ahead with these primaries?
I think they really need to have as much voter education as possible to use their bully pulpit to clarify for voters what their options are. It's very new for us to have mainly postal mail and to have voting options in person be limited the way they are right now. So there's a lot of space being taken up by the protests, but the authorities need to also inform voters about how they can effectively vote today as well.
Marcia, let's look a few months down the track, because for an election year, this is the most unlikely way for an election year to play out. What sort of preparations, what sort of election are you expecting by November?
It is hard to say. Because of the healthcare pandemic, we don't know what voting is gonna look like in November. There's states that are using the primaries to figure out how primarily vote by mail could work. And I anticipate in November we'll have a mix of vote by mail and some in-person options. But those in-person options need to be safe and secure. Our states need funding in order to make that happen. So there's a lot that we need to do to ensure that our voting is, that we're ready for November and that everyone will be able to vote.
Do you think there'll be legal challenges to ensure that everyone does have that opportunity? There may be some states that try and stymie, multiple options.
Yes, and my organization, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, has been involved in those legal challenges for the primaries. And for example, we've had legal challenges in states to ensure that their ballots in languages other than English. We want to make sure that the ballots, voters not only get the ballots in time, but they will be counted. So I do think there will be challenges. But first, what we're trying to do is to engage election officials on these issues to ensure that they're properly prepared.
Marcia, I can't let you go without just asking for your reflection on the last week.
It has been quite incredible. I actually had long conversations with my 18-year-old who went out to protest and what it means to protest during coronavirus. But it was very important for her to be out there and have her voice heard. And I understand, as an African American, a person of color, this is an important moment for us to lift up the racism and the disparities in our society.
So many people have commented that this is in large part a frustration by young people at what has happened to the political system in the United States, the divide. Is that the sense you get from your daughter?
It is indeed. And it's, the coronavirus has really lifted up the disparities because of its disproportionate impact on people of color, which look at our healthcare system. And then when we layer on top of that the police brutality against people of color and also the other killings that have recently taken place, it is something that young people feel they can't be silent about any longer.
Marcia, we wish you well as these weeks and days play out. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.